This is a training session regarding the entry and maintenance of vendor records in our Accounts Payable vendor file. In order to accomplish this task, we select Vendors from the Accounts Payable menu. We now see a list of all our currently entered vendors in alphabetical order. We can click at the top of other columns in the list box to change the sort order. Using these two buttons, we can either print an envelope or a mailing label for the highlighted vendor, or send an email to the highlighted vendor. Now let's make some changes to a vendor record. We can either highlight the vendor and click the Change button, or just double-click on the vendor record and this window will come into view. On this vendor entry window, we see a vendor ID number. This number is assigned to new vendors automatically. We can now enter the vendor name, address, and other information. We can also enter additional phone numbers and contacts here. Clicking this Map button will generate an internet map of the vendor location, optionally with driving directions from our main company address. The second tab includes miscellaneous information about this vendor. The classification is a user-defined field. Pick the appropriate classification from the pull-down menu, or add a new one by typing the classification name here. Enter the vendor's federal tax ID number here and an optional credit limit. Here you can enter the general ledger expense account associated with this vendor. For example, if this vendor is your landlord, you could enter the GL account number for your rent expense account. If you will be paying this vendor's invoices using one of your credit card accounts, enter the account number here, so it will be the default method of payment. The system will assign the accounts payable and subcontracts payable account numbers from system setup. There is usually no need to change these accounts. If retention will routinely be withheld from payments to this vendor, enter the normal retention percent here. Also, you can indicate here whether this is a vendor from whom you purchase materials, a subcontractor you hire to perform portions of your projects, or an employee. You could enter an employee into the vendor file, so you can pay them reimbursement amounts outside of the payroll system. This button lets us set up Electronic Funds Transfer, or EFT, for this vendor. This means that instead of paying the vendor using a check or credit card, you can have your bank send your payment directly to the vendor's bank account. Enter the name of the vendor's bank, along with the bank routing number and account number. Indicate whether the account is a savings or a checking account. This checkbox is only here to let the system create a dry run transfer file when a payment is made. The box should be unchecked normally. If the vendor becomes inactive, or in other words, you no longer use the vendor's services, you may uncheck this box. Inactive vendors can be excluded from listings and reports. If payments to this vendor normally are made to the vendor and a second payee, enter the vendor number of the second or co-payee here. If the co-payee changes frequently, don't enter the co-payee here. It can be entered during payment selection. Check this box if for some reason you need to suspend payments to this vendor for a time. Check this box to give the vendor special designation that will allow you to print reports or labels for just mailing list vendors. If this box is checked, then if multiple invoices from this vendor are selected for payment during the same check run, a separate check will be printed for each invoice. If this box is checked, then a check written to this vendor for a trade invoice will include a description of each invoice line item for each invoice paid on the check stub. If this box is checked, then at the end of the check printing process, the system will prompt you to print a lien release or lien waiver form for the amount of the payment. The tax rate entered here will be applied to all invoices from this vendor. This pull-down list lets you indicate what type of invoice will normally be entered for this vendor. If a selection is made and an invoice of the other type is entered for this vendor, the system will give the operator a warning message. Select the desired payment type from this list. This will serve as a default during invoice entry. The customer account fields here are designed to be used for vendors with whom you have a customer account, such as a phone service provider or a utility company. Enter your customer account number here and indicate whether you wish for this account number to appear on the check face. Whether or not you check this box, the customer account number will always be included on the check stub. The Doing Business As fields are designed to let you print checks payable to an individual doing business as a company name. To make this feature work, just check the box and enter the person's first and last name in this field. In this section, you can see the amounts that you have paid to this vendor for the current year and for all previous years. You can also indicate here whether you need to print a 1099 form for this vendor, and if so, what type of 1099 is to be printed. The next tab is the Terms tab. Here you can set up information that will be used when you enter invoices from this vendor into the system to calculate due dates, discount dates, and discount amounts. On this next tab, we have the Insurance and Expiration information. This is where we indicate whether this vendor carries general liability, auto, excess liability, and/or workers' compensation insurance coverage. We can indicate the policy information and expiration dates for any of these insurance types. We can also enter any other documents that have an expiration date.
At the bottom of the window, we see how the system can use the insurance information we enter above. Here, we can instruct the system to warn us of expired documents or pending expirations. Here, we can instruct the system to print expiration information on check stubs. Now let's spend a moment talking about this compliance setting. Normally, the system will fire off warnings only if we have checked the certificate on file box and the expiration date is a date that has passed. If you want to use the expiration date as the determining factor, leave the compliance setting at Not Used. There may be times, however, when a vendor is out of compliance even though their certificate hasn't yet expired. If this is the case, you can use this compliance pull-down to indicate that the vendor is non-compliant by selecting one of these compliance status settings.
The next tab is the User Defined tab. Here we can enter in basically any type of information we want about this vendor. You will notice that the prompts are merely shown as text until we check the Edit Prompts checkbox. We are then allowed to change the definition of any of the categories. The category goes on the left-hand side, and the vendor-specific data for that category goes on the right. For example, one of our user-defined fields might be the number of people the vendor employs. We would type in here, number of employees. Then we would indicate that this particular vendor has 38 employees. In another vendor record, the prompt will still say number of employees, but that vendor may have only 10 employees. The Invoice History tab merely shows a list of all the invoices that have been sent to us from this vendor. We can have the list include all invoices, only invoices that have not been paid, or only invoices that have been paid. Click this button to view more information about the highlighted invoice. Much like the Invoice History tab, the Purchase Order History tab shows a list of all the purchase orders that we have sent to this vendor. Click this button to view more information about the highlighted purchase order. On this tab, we can enter one or more Remit To addresses for this vendor. Occasionally, vendor payments need to be sent to an address other than the vendor's physical address. If this is the case, we enter this Remit To address here.
Click the Add button
and enter the particulars of the Remit To address. During invoice entry and payment selection, you will now be able to select this address instead of the vendor's physical address for payment of the invoice. If you flag one of your Remit To addresses as the default, all vendor invoice payments will include your selected Remit To address on the printed check. Here, you can enter any kind of attachments to the vendor record. These can be any image or document file. The next tab gives us the ability to attach notes to this vendor file. For the most part, vendor notes are the same as notes entered elsewhere in the system. One added feature of a vendor note is that you can have the system flash this note
during invoice entry, payment selection, or purchase order entry by tagging the appropriate special behaviors here.
For example, if you enter a note detailing a dispute with this vendor,
and tag the option to display this message when entering invoices,
then when this vendor is selected during invoice entry, a message will pop up showing the header and text of the note. Once we have finished entering our vendor information, we click on the OK button to save our entries. And this ends this training session on entering and changing accounts payable vendor information.